Welcome, weary listener, to a quiet corner of the past. As the day's last light fades beyond your window, settle into your most comfortable space and let the gentle currents of history carry you. Tonight, we'll unroll a grand sprawling tapestry of Regency England, not with the usual fanfare, but with a hushed reverence. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine the soft rustle of silk in a distant ballroom, the quiet clatter of carriage wheels on a cobbled London street, or perhaps the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke from a humble country cottage. We'll speak of bustling seasons and elegant dances, of the silent pressures on a noble woman to secure her future. And then, with equal quietude, we'll turn our gaze to the unyielding dawn-to-dusk rhythm of the peasant woman's life. No need to exert yourself. No need to strain. Just let these stories, these whispers from another time, wash over you, gently as you drift towards a peaceful slumber. Picture it. A pale spring sun glints off the River Thames as carriage wheels rattle over cobblestones slick with rain. In Mayfair, shutters fly open, servants polish marble steps to a blinding gleam, and milliners and florists rub their hands with glee, for the London season has begun. And with it comes a curious, enchanting spectacle, part theatre, part battleground, and entirely orchestrated. This was the realm of debutantes and dowagers, of dashing young heirs and tight-lipped chaperones, of fan signals, whispered wagers, and reputations made or ruined before dessert was even served. To understand the London season in the Regency era, one must first recognise what it was not. It was not leisure. It was not even, strictly speaking, entertainment. It was an institution, rigid, ruthless, and deeply necessary for the maintenance of Britain's aristocratic ecosystem. At its core, the season was a matchmaking arena, a social chessboard upon which the fates of entire families were manoeuvred with the precision of military campaigns. It was the ultimate, very public, very expensive display of dynastic ambition, where the prize was not a glittering trophy, but the continuation and elevation of a family line. It began traditionally in early spring, often late March or early April, and meticulously coincided with the sitting of Parliament. This was no accident. The gentlemen of the aristocracy, the very fathers and brothers responsible for overseeing these social crusades, had official business in the capital. Thus, the nobility would flock from their sprawling, often damp country estates to London, swelling its population, packing its drawing rooms, and transforming the capital into a honeycomb of soirees, routs, and elegant chaos. While gentlemen concerned themselves with politics, business, and their exclusive clubs like White's or Brooks's, where fortunes were gambled away and political careers were quietly forged, the women, particularly the young unmarried ones, were thrust into the unforgiving spotlight. For them, this was not merely a social outing, it was a mission. This was the coming out season, the moment when a girl from a royal noble or immensely wealthy family was officially presented to society as eligible for marriage. And it all began with one defining, terrifying moment, the presentation at court. Imagine the scene, a young woman, often just 17 or 18, her heart hammering against her corseted ribs, clad in a mandatory white satin gown with 3 regulation ostrich feathers, quivering precariously in her elaborately styled hair. She trembles slightly, perhaps even visibly, as she enters the opulent, suffocatingly grand drawing rooms of St. James's Palace. Before her, a figure of supreme authority, the monarch, during the Regency era that would often be the formidable Queen Charlotte prior to her death in 1818, and later Queen Caroline or other members of the royal family acting in her place, radiating a chilling formality. The debutante sinks into a deep, painstakingly practised curtsy, holding her pose just long enough to risk toppling from faint nerves or the sheer weight of her elaborate coiffure. Then, with a composure belying her inner turmoil, she walks backward, never, ever turning her back on royalty, out of the room. It was ceremonial, absurdly nerve-wracking, and utterly essential. A girl not presented at court might as well not exist in the social sphere. Her eligibility was immediately called into question, and her chances of securing a desirable match plummeted like a badly tied cravat. It was the social equivalent of having your name whispered from the tower's scaffold utterly damning. Once the ordeal of presentation was over, and the debutante had successfully navigated the backward retreat without tripping over her train or faint from sheer terror, the real work began. The London season was a relentless, dizzying whirl of events, each with its own arcane rules, specific costumes, and layers of coded meanings that only the truly initiated could decipher. At the pinnacle of this social Everest stood Almac's assembly rooms on King Street. Despite their remarkably modest decor, notoriously lukewarm refreshments, and a general air of genteel austerity, Almac's held a near mythical, utterly indispensable status. Why? Because a voucher to Almac's meant legitimacy. It was the golden ticket, the ultimate imprimatur of social acceptance. The formidable lady patronesses, a formidable committee of aristocratic arbiters of taste, led by formidable figures like the notorious Lady Jersey and the equally influential Lady Cowper, guarded access to Almack's like Cerberus at the gates of Hades, only perhaps with more pointed stairs and fewer heads. A single misstep, an inappropriate hemline, a whisper of scandal, an unpardonable lack of lineage, or even daring to arrive after 11 p.m, could bar you permanently, consigning you to a season of social oblivion. Within Almac's pale yellow walls, under the flickering gaslight, a relatively new invention, still prone to the occasional sputter, young ladies danced with the season's most eligible bachelors, though danced may be too generous a term for some of the rigid, almost performative movements. The quadrille, a formal geometric dance, reigned supreme, allowing for polite conversation and careful observation. The waltz, still a relatively new import from the continent, was considered daringly, scandalously intimate, its close embrace sparking rumours faster than a bonfire in dry hay. And the country dance, while more lively, still demanded strict decorum. Each required not only skill and grace, but also an almost militant adherence to social protocol. A misplaced hand during a waltz, a clumsy step, or a laugh that was a fraction too loud could spark immediate, damaging whispers. It was a social minefield where one wrong move could detonate a reputation. Dressing for the season was not merely a matter of personal preference. It was itself a full-time, highly strategic occupation, demanding the keenest eye for fashion and the deepest pockets. For debutantes, the preferred palette consisted of ethereal white creamy ivories or the palest of pastels, colours explicitly designed to signal maidenhood, purity and availability. Necklines, in a daring departure from earlier eras, plunged, sleeves puffed into fashionable gigots or slender classical lines, and delicate silk gloves reached the elbow, offering a tantalising glimpse of bare arm. No self-respecting debutante would be caught dead without her indispensable reticule. A small, often beaded handbag, as pockets were absent from the slender gowns. Her fan, a tool of flirtation and coded communication far more than cooling. And her gossamer-thin dancing slippers, often tied with ribbons around the ankle. Hair was elaborately styled, often piled high with curls and adorned with pearls, ribbons or artificial flowers, a fragile crown of femininity, and perfumes, sweet, floral, and occasionally cloyingly heavy, lingered in every hallway, a fragrant, invisible calling card. Gentlemen, not to be outdone in sartorial precision, wore tailored evening coats of deep blue or black, exquisitely embroidered waistcoats, pristine white shirts, and neckcloths intricately tied in fashionable knots. The Osbaldiston, the Gordian, the Tory, each signalling a subtle message. Their breeches or pantaloons were often buff or cream, and their gleaming Hessian boots, polished to perfection, completed the ensemble. Every stitch, every fold, every strategic splash of cologne was a deliberate statement of status, wealth, and impeccable taste. But the season was far from being solely composed of the rigid decorum of Almack's and the polite promenades of Hyde Park. The social calendar was a relentless, multifaceted beast that consumed every waking hour. There were routs, crowded, often suffocating affairs hosted by ambitious hostesses desperate to prove their popularity. So many guests would be squeezed into drawing rooms that comfortable conversation was impossible. Card tables became battlegrounds for strategic wagering, and punch was often the only thing flowing freely, usually watered down to protect the delicate sensibilities and fortunes of the attendees. Then came the tantalizing allure of masquerade balls, where masks allowed for bolder flirtations, hushed confidences, and occasional daring indiscretions. The anonymity provided a tantalizing thrill, often leading to whispered rumours that stretched long after the masks came off. Theatre nights at Drury Lane or Covent Garden were not just about the play. They were equally, if not more, about being seen. Private boxes were rented at exorbitant rates, allowing families to observe and be observed, to subtly acknowledge acquaintances, and to make silent judgments on each other's attire and companions. Opera, garden parties held in the elegant grounds of country estates bordering London, and a bewildering array of charity events filled every remaining corner of the calendar. From auctions for noble causes to fashionable exhibitions of art or curiosities, every opportunity for public appearance was seized. And of course, there was Hyde Park's Rotten Row, the infamous gravel track where carriages paraded, horses pranced, and bonnets bobbed in a silent daily display of wealth and eligibility. This was the open-air showroom, where mothers subtly showcased their daughters like prize stallions at market, their expressions carefully composed. Gentlemen, riding alongside, would tip their hats with practised nonchalance, while ladies offered glances with strategic intent, their fans fluttering like nervous butterflies. A marriage proposal, the ultimate prize, might be foreshadowed by nothing more than the lending of a parasol during an unexpected shower, an invitation for an afternoon drive in an open barouche, or a particularly protracted conversation at a polite distance from a chaperone. Every subtle interaction, every prolonged gaze, every shared laugh was meticulously scrutinized for signs of a burgeoning attachment. But beneath the lace and ribbons, the Regency season was often a brutal, unforgiving game. A young woman, once presented, typically had just one, perhaps two seasons. To secure a match before she was considered on the shelf, a fate worse than social death, often condemning her to a life of genteel poverty as a spinster, dependent on the charity of relatives. And not just any match would do. Marriages were rarely about love or even passionate attachment, though a fond regard was certainly hoped for. Instead, they were strategic alliances, about money, titles, land, or political clout. Love, while not entirely irrelevant, a practical affection could make the arrangement more palatable, was a distant fourth in the hierarchy of importance, usually trailing far behind fortune, family, and connection. Dowagers, those formidable matriarchs who had weathered countless seasons, and professional matchmakers worked overtime, their keen eyes surveying the landscape for opportunities. Gossip, the lifeblood of the season, fluttered through drawing rooms like a second language, its whispers capable of building or destroying reputations in an instant. Scandals, whether real, exaggerated, or entirely invented, could ruin a girl's prospects overnight. One ill-considered dance with a notorious rake, one whispered flirtation without a chaperone present, one fleeting moment of genuine unguarded emotion in public, and the season was effectively over for the unfortunate girl, her social currency depreciated beyond repair. The pressure was immense, a constant gnawing anxiety that often led to nervous exhaustion, tears, and even desperate stratagems. And yet, Within this pressure cooker, amidst the calculated risks and the brutal social Darwinism, there were genuine triumphs. There were dazzling matches, dukes marrying merchant heiresses with plump dowries, bringing new money into old crumbling fortunes. There were impoverished baronets swept away by governesses of quick wit and unshakable dignity, proving that character on rare occasions could indeed trump a lack of fortune. There were even stories of genuine courtship that began with little more than a shared glance across a crowded room, blossoming against all odds into something resembling affection. And while cynics might scoff at the transactional nature of it all, many of these marriages, once forged, lasted longer and proved more companionable than one might expect from such a seemingly cold, calculating process. Shared duties, mutual respect, and the common goal of maintaining the family's standing often fostered a partnership that grew into affection, if not passionate love. By July, as Parliament recessed and the relentless social calendar began to slow, the Great Migration began. Families returned to their vast country estates, carrying with them the trophies of their social labour, new connections, lucrative matches, and a fresh supply of gossip to tide them over until the following year. Some returned victorious, their daughters engaged, their family fortunes secured. Others returned with wilting hopes, empty dance cards, and the crushing burden of another failed season, already dreading the financial and emotional toll of the next. But the season never truly ended. Letters continued to flow between London and the Shires, carrying news, invitations, and the seeds of future alliances. Invitations were extended for country house visits, allowing courtships to continue in a more private, less scrutinised setting. And matchmakers, those tireless agents of social destiny, quietly plotted next year's strategy with military precision, already identifying the new crop of debutantes and eligible bachelors. The dance, though quieter, went on, a perpetual motion machine of social engineering. And so, the Regency London season, for all its elegance and refinement, was not merely a pageant. It was a system, a cultural engine designed to manage the social order, redistribute wealth and power, and reinforce the values of a class that knew exactly how precarious its position could become in a rapidly changing world. It was shimmering, yes. It was intoxicating in its display of wealth and beauty. But it was also a performance, a meticulously choreographed ballet where every curtsy, every conversation, every floral arrangement was loaded with meaning. It was a season not just of balls, but of decisions. One wrong turn, one ill-judged word, one whispered scandal, and a family's fortunes could fall like a crushed fan beneath a duchess's slipper, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of a dance that had suddenly brutally stopped. It was beautiful, it was brutal, and it was entirely, magnificently Regency. The shimmering curtain of the London season, with its frantic dance cards and whispered proposals, typically fell not just on a social year, but on a young woman's status as an eligible unattached commodity. For the fortunate few, or perhaps the strategically astute, it culminated in a successful match, a proposal accepted, an engagement announced, and the grand, formidable journey into matrimony. But if you believed that a noble woman's life became a serene idyll of endless leisure and romantic bliss, once the wedding vows were exchanged, and the bells had ceased their joyful, or perhaps relieved, pealing, then prepare for a rather bracing dip into the cold reality of Regency aristocratic marriage. The true work, my dear, had only just begun. From the moment she ascended the altar as a bride to a titled man, be he a baron, an earl, a duke, or anything in between, a noble woman's purpose in life fundamentally shifted. No longer was she the object of scrutiny, judged solely on her beauty, wit, or dance steps. She became, almost overnight, the very embodiment of her husband's lineage, the guardian of his legacy, and the chief executive of his sprawling domestic empire. Her personal identity, already somewhat fluid within the confines of aristocratic society, now largely dissolved into that of Lady Husband's title. her individual aspirations often subsumed by the weight of her new, grand responsibilities. Her first and foremost duty, often discussed with a candour that would shock modern sensibilities, was to produce an heir, preferably a male one, and ideally several, to ensure the continuation of the title and the family line. This was not a casual hope. It was a societal imperative, a biological contract signed at the altar. The pressure was immense, a silent, pervasive anxiety that shadowed every moonlit night and every passing month. Childbirth in the Regency era was a perilous affair, a journey into the valley of the shadow of death that claimed countless women, noble and common alike. For a noble woman, lying in, a period of confinement after childbirth could last for weeks, isolating her while she recovered from the physical trauma, often attended by a midwife and female relatives rather than a physician. Each successful delivery of a healthy child, especially a son, was a triumph, solidifying her position, securing her husband's favour, and often his relief, and ensuring the continuity of the estate. But each miscarriage, stillbirth, or, God forbid, the consistent arrival of only daughters, chipped away at her status, fueling whispers and potentially leading to marital strain, or even, in extreme cases, the husband seeking a legal separation or an heir through other, less reputable means. Beyond the vital task of procreation, the newly minted noblewoman became the manager of a vast and complex household. This was no small feat. A titled man rarely possessed just one residence. There was the ancestral country seat, perhaps several smaller properties, and crucially a grand townhouse in London for the season and parliamentary sittings. Each of these demanded meticulous oversight. The noblewoman was, in essence, the CEO of an intricately structured domestic corporation. Her staff could number in the dozens, even hundreds, from the house steward, butler and housekeeper, down to the scullery maids, stable hands and gardeners. She was responsible for hiring and firing, often through her housekeeper, but the ultimate decision was hers, managing wages, overseeing the procurement of vast quantities of food and supplies, ensuring the proper maintenance of the house, and supervising the education and discipline of her children. Her day, particularly in the country, was a relentless march of practicalities. She would wake early, often conducting morning inspections of the kitchens, larders and linen presses. She would meet with her housekeeper to plan meals for the family and any guests, often for weeks in advance, taking into account the season, the availability of produce, and the dietary preferences of her husband. She might spend hours in the still room, a vital hub where she, often with the head housekeeper, supervised the making of preserves, cordials, medicinal tinctures and cosmetics, a far cry from simply ordering from a shop. She was expected to have a working knowledge of accounts, to ensure the household budget was adhered to, and to keep meticulous records. Her skills in managing servants, negotiating with suppliers, and overseeing vast inventories were more akin to those of a modern logistics expert than a delicate flower. In London, during the season, her role shifted from rural manager to sophisticated hostess and social gatekeeper. Her townhouse became a central stage for entertaining. She would issue invitations for dinners, routes and balls, carefully curating guest lists to include influential figures, potential matches for her unmarried younger siblings or friends, and anyone whose presence would elevate her husband's standing. Her success as a hostess directly reflected on her husband's social and political capital. She had to ensure the food was exquisite, the company scintillating, and the atmosphere just right for strategic conversations and subtle social manoeuvring. Furthermore, she became a chaperone for younger female relatives, navigating the treacherous waters of the marriage market from the other side, her watchful eye a constant presence at balls and promenades. Beyond these demanding duties, a noblewoman was expected to engage in charitable works. This was not merely an act of benevolence, but a social expectation, a public display of Christian piety and aristocratic responsibility. She would oversee local schools, distribute alms to the poor, visit the sick, and support local charities. These activities solidified her position within the local community and enhanced her family's reputation as benevolent patrons rather than distant landlords. Her personal life, ironically, was often characterized by a surprising lack of personal freedom. While she commanded a vast household, her movements outside of it were severely curtailed. She rarely travelled unaccompanied, always requiring a maid or companion. Her social interactions were meticulously observed, and any deviation from strict decorum could lead to scandal, bringing ruin upon her husband's name and prospects. Intellectual pursuits, while sometimes indulged in privately, were rarely displayed publicly. Accomplishments in music, drawing or needlework were valued, but rigorous academic study was generally deemed unfeminine and unsuitable. Her leisure time, if any could be carved out, often involved reading novels, sometimes clandestinely if they were considered too racy, playing music or indulging in the popular pastime of sketching. The relationship with her husband was a complex tapestry of duty, respect, and occasionally genuine affection. Love, as previously noted, was often a happy accident rather than a prerequisite. Their marriage was a partnership, a business arrangement aimed at perpetuating the family name and consolidating wealth. Her husband might be a kind and considerate man, or he might be a distant, demanding, or even cruel one. Infidelity, particularly on the husband's part, was unfortunately common, though rarely acknowledged openly. The noblewoman was expected to turn a blind eye, maintaining appearances for the sake of the family's reputation. Her power within the marriage was largely indirect, exerted through persuasion, her influence over the children, and her indispensable role in managing the household and social affairs. Her dower, the portion of the estate settled on her for her widowhood, and pin money, an annual allowance for her personal expenses, were crucial, granting her a degree of financial independence, though still under her husband's ultimate control. The constraints she faced were immense. Her health was constantly at risk from repeated pregnancies. Her societal role was rigidly defined, leaving little room for individual ambition or self-expression beyond the accepted norms. Her legal rights were limited. Her property, upon marriage, generally became her husband's, and she had little independent legal standing. Divorce was practically impossible and socially ruinous, leaving most women trapped in unhappy unions. Yet, within these formidable structures, many noblewomen found ways to exert significant influence. Their meticulous management ensured the family's financial stability. Their social acumen built crucial alliances. Their children, carefully raised and educated under their watchful eye, became the next generation of power brokers. They were not merely ornamental figures, they were indispensable pillars of the aristocratic system, their quiet, relentless labour providing the very foundation upon which their husbands' public lives were built. So, the next time you picture a Regency noblewoman in her exquisite gown gliding across a ballroom floor, remember that beneath the silk and jewels lay a woman shouldering immense responsibilities. She was a CEO, a mother, a healer, a diplomat, and a gatekeeper, constantly navigating a world of rigid expectations and subtle dangers. Her life was a demanding symphony of strategy and resilience, played out not just in grand ballrooms, but in the meticulous planning of meals, the careful discipline of children, and the quiet, often unacknowledged toil that kept the engine of the aristocracy running smoothly. A grand and constrained existence indeed. Having previously peered behind the velvet curtain of Regency nobility, where silk and strategy governed every breath and the greatest anxieties often stemmed from a misplaced fan or an ill-timed curtsy, let us now descend, rather abruptly, from the polished drawing rooms and into the dust and dung of the rural English countryside. Here, life for the vast majority, particularly for women, was not a symphony of social climbing, but a relentless, often brutal, concerto of survival. If the noblewoman's existence was a gilded cage, albeit one with excellent catering and perilous social traps, the peasant woman's was a ceaseless treadmill, bound by the seasons, the whims of the gentry, and the unyielding demands of an empty stomach. Her days were a tapestry woven not with leisure but with exhaustion, her dreams often no grander than the hope for a bountiful harvest and a night free from the gnawing pangs of hunger. Her early life was not spent learning delicate embroidery or perfecting her curtsy at a fashionable boarding school. From the moment she could walk, a peasant girl was initiated into a world of endless toil, her tiny hands quickly finding purpose. Childhood was a brief, almost luxurious interlude before the serious business of contributing to the family economy began. By the age of 5 or 6, she would already be performing basic chores, fetching water from the communal well or nearby stream, a task that never ceased and often meant multiple trips a day with heavy splashing buckets, regardless of weather. She would gather firewood, often from sparse and dwindling common lands, a daily expedition that could be perilous and time-consuming. Within the cramped confines of the cottage, she learned to tend to younger siblings, acting as a miniature nursemaid, rocking cradles, and keeping small hands out of the perpetually simmering pot over the hearth. Her hands, perpetually stained and calloused, learned early the rhythm of work. As she grew, her responsibilities scaled up dramatically. By 10 or 12, she might be helping her mother with the more demanding tasks, grinding grain with a hand mill, the monotonous rhythm a constant background noise, kneading heavy dough for the daily bread, her small muscles aching, or assisting in the crucial back-breaking work of the fields during harvest, stooping for hours to glean forgotten grains or carrying heavy bundles of hay. Her education was entirely practical, learned through observation and immediate necessity, passed down from mother to daughter, from grandmother to grandchild. There were no tutors, no formal lessons in deportment or polite conversation. Instead, she learned how to spin yarn, knit stockings, churn butter, preserve what little food the family possessed, and apply basic herbal remedies for common ailments. Literacy was a rare luxury, prayer books being perhaps the only written material she would ever encounter. And even then, reading was not guaranteed. Her body hardened, her hands roughened, and her spirit, though perhaps worn, became resilient. The concept of personal ambition beyond securing enough food and shelter for the day was a foreign luxury. Courtship for a peasant woman was a world away from the elaborate societal dances of Almack's. Romance, in the delicate, sentimental sense so beloved by Regency novelists, was a fleeting, almost secondary indulgence. Marriage was, first and foremost, a pragmatic economic alliance, a merging of two impoverished existences to create a slightly less impoverished one. Potential partners were not found at glittering balls, but in the fields, at the local market on market days, or at the weekly church service, which served as a vital social hub. Compatibility was less about shared interests and more about shared capacity for hard labour, a sturdy constitution, and perhaps a few extra shillings or a decent productive cow. Young men and women worked side by side, their attractions often born from shared hardship, mutual respect for a strong back and a willing spirit, and the pragmatic recognition that two sets of working hands were better than one. Courtship involved walking out, perhaps a Sunday visit to the girl's family, and certainly a close knowing observation by the entire community, as reputation was everything in a small village. A fallen woman, one who had lost her virginity outside of marriage, had few prospects for a respectable union, and her family would bear the social stigma. When a match was decided upon, it meant pooling meagre resources, a few pieces of furniture, perhaps a pig, or the promise of shared labour on a small rented plot. Weddings themselves were simple, local affairs, often conducted at the parish church, followed by a communal feast that might strain the resources of several families, a potluck of meagre contributions, fuelled by local ale. There were no elaborate trousseaux, no grand honeymoons, merely the grim satisfaction of having secured a partner for the endless battle of subsistence. Once married, her daily life became a relentless, bone-wearying cycle dictated by the sun, the seasons and the perpetual demands of feeding her burgeoning family. The peasant woman was the tireless engine of the household economy, her days beginning before dawn and often ending long after dark. Her home, typically a cramped single-room cottage with a thatched roof, rudimentary windows, often unglazed, covered only by wooden shutters or oiled cloth, and a packed earth floor, offered little comfort or convenience. Heating came from a central hearth, where a fire was meticulously maintained using precious firewood or turf. Its smoke often filled the single living space before finding its way out a hole in the roof, coating everything in a fine layer of soot. Furniture was sparse, a crude table, a few stools, perhaps a rough straw mattress for the parents, while children often slept on the floor or shared a single lumpy bed. Privacy was a luxury unknown, with the entire family, and sometimes livestock, sharing the same confined space. The constant need for water defined much of her day. It had to be fetched daily from a communal well or stream, a chore that often meant multiple trips, carrying heavy buckets back to the cottage over uneven, muddy paths. This precious water was used sparingly, a little for rudimentary cooking, a bit heated over the fire for the occasional rudimentary wash of hands and face, and for drinking. Full bathing was virtually non-existent, a rare, perhaps annual, event if even that. Laundry was an infrequent and arduous task, involving harsh lye soap made from ash and animal fat, boiling water over an open fire, and the strenuous beating of clothes in a tub, followed by drying on bushes or lines, weather permitting. The constant battle against dirt, fleas, lice and mice was a Sisyphean one, given the earthen floors, thatched roofs and close proximity to animals. Food preparation was a never-ending task, demanding her constant attention. The diet was meagre and monotonous, heavily reliant on bread, often made from coarser grains like rye or barley, which she would mill or take to the Lord's mill for a fee, and bake in a communal oven or her own hearth. Bread was the staff of life, consumed at every meal. It was supplemented with whatever vegetables could be grown in a small garden, plot cabbages, root vegetables like turnips and onions, and perhaps some beans or peas. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps a bit of salt pork or, if fortune smiled, a rabbit caught by her husband, or a chicken raised for eggs, only slaughtered on special occasions. Famine was not an abstract concept. It was a constant, terrifying threat, and the success of the harvest dictated not just their income, but their very survival. She would spend hours kneading dough, tending a sputtering fire, making simple pottages or stews, and preserving what little they had by salting, drying, or pickling. Foraging for wild berries, nuts, mushrooms, a risky business given the lack of botanical knowledge, and wild greens provided crucial, though often meagre, nutritional supplements. Dietary deficiencies were rampant, leading to chronic fatigue, illness, and a diminished capacity for the relentless labour required of them. Beyond domestic chores, her labour extended directly to the fields, often alongside her husband. She would assist with planting, weeding rows, and the gruelling work of harvest, stooping for hours to glean forgotten grains that had fallen to the ground, every single kernel representing a potential meal. Haymaking, turning and collecting the drying grass, was another physically demanding task. She might also be responsible for tending to a few chickens, perhaps a pig, and ensuring any milk from a family cow was churned into butter. There was no concept of a work-day ending. Labour ceased only when utter exhaustion finally claimed her. The lines between domestic and agricultural work blurred entirely. Her home was her workshop, her kitchen a crucial part of the family's economic engine, and her hands were perpetually in motion. In addition to her core duties, many peasant women engaged in cottage industries or by employment to supplement the family's meagre income. This could involve spinning thread from raw wool or flax, the ubiquitous hand spindle a constant companion, knitting stockings for sale, lace-making or straw-plaiting for hats, often working for middlemen who paid pitiful wages for long hours. Some might brew small beer for local consumption, sell eggs from their chickens, or take on casual labour during peak seasons. This income, though vital, was precarious, dependent on market demand and the availability of materials. The constant physical exertion, poor nutrition, and lack of proper rest took a heavy toll on her body, leading to early aging, chronic pain, and a susceptibility to illness. Then came the inevitable cycle of childbearing, a terrifying and often repeated event in a peasant woman's life. Pregnancy was not a time of pampered rest or specialised medical care. She continued her rigorous daily labour until the very onset of labour, driven by the absolute necessity of maintaining the family's income. There were no prenatal vitamins, no regular checkups, only the shared wisdom of older women in the village and perhaps a few folk remedies. Childbirth occurred in the cramped confines of her own home, often in the very bed where she slept with her family. She was attended not by a doctor, but by a local midwife, a skilled and experienced woman from the village, and perhaps a few female neighbours or relatives. Medical intervention was virtually non-existent. There were no pain medications, no sterile environments, no emergency surgical options for complications. It was a raw, primal, and incredibly dangerous ordeal. The screams of a woman in labour were a common and often terrifying sound in the village, a grim reminder of life's fragility. Mortality rates for both mother and child were appallingly high. Death in childbirth was a tragically common end for peasant women, and the burial of infants or young children was a grimly familiar, almost seasonal ritual. If the mother survived, she would be back to her duties within days, perhaps a week, driven by the sheer inability to afford prolonged rest. Her body, already worn, was further ravaged by the demands of repeated pregnancies and births. Child-rearing for the peasant woman was also fundamentally different from that of her noble counterpart. Survival was the paramount concern. Infants were often swaddled tightly and kept close for warmth and ease of feeding, often sharing the family bed for convenience and to avoid the cold. Breastfeeding was universal and prolonged, not just for nourishment, but as a crucial, though unreliable, form of natural birth control, helping to space out pregnancies, however minimally. Children, once past infancy, were not indulged or educated in a formal sense. They were integrated into the family's labour force as soon as they were physically able, their small hands quickly learning to contribute. Older children looked after younger ones, freeing the mother for other tasks. Play was unstructured, often involving mimicking adult tasks and using discarded items as toys. Discipline was strict, often physical, and born of necessity. Idle hands meant less food, and a hungry, unruly child was a burden the family could ill afford. The ultimate goal was to raise children who were capable, strong, and prepared to take on the same unrelenting cycle of labour as their parents. Sentimental attachment, while undoubtedly present, had to be tempered by the harsh realities of a life where every mouth to feed was a profound economic pressure. The very idea of formal schooling beyond the occasional charity lesson from the local parson, a brief exposure to the catechism, was an unattainable dream. Childhood diseases like measles, smallpox, and whooping cough ravaged peasant communities, and a child reaching adulthood was itself a testament to hardiness and luck. Despite the relentless hardship, village life provided a crucial social fabric. Community ties were strong, born of mutual dependence. Neighbours would help each other during harvest, childbirth, or illness, sharing meagre resources and labour in times of need. The church served as a central gathering point, offering spiritual solace, a modicum of social interaction, and a source of news from outside the village. The local pub or alehouse was often a social centre, though perhaps more frequented by men. Women might go there to sell their produce or gather gossip. Local festivals, though few and far between, and often tied to agricultural cycles, provided rare moments of respite and celebration, a chance for village dances, communal meals, and temporary forgetfulness of the daily grind. Yet, even within this community, the peasant woman's agency was severely limited. Her life was largely dictated by the whims of the weather, the success of the harvest, and crucially, the decisions of her landlord. A harsh lord could raise rents, enclose common lands, or evict families with little notice, instantly plunging them into destitution. She had little recourse, her voice unheard beyond the confines of her village, her legal rights virtually non-existent. In essence, the peasant woman's life in Regency England was an unending testament to resilience. She was the bedrock of rural society, the tireless backbone of her family, performing physical labour that would break most modern individuals, all while navigating the profound dangers of childbirth and the constant spectre of hunger and disease. Her existence was stripped of nearly all comfort and luxury, her days measured not by social engagements, but by the relentless rhythm of sunrise to sunset, seed to harvest, birth to inevitable, often early, death. It was a life lived at the very edge of subsistence, a stark, unyielding contrast to the concerns of the elite, reminding us that for every silken gown in Mayfair there were countless rough homespun dresses worn thin from endless, uncelebrated toil. Her strength, her endurance, and her quiet determination ensured the survival, not just of her family, but of the entire social structure, silently underpinning the grand facade of Regency elegance. And so, as we draw this extensive journey to a close, we look back not just on a single life, but on the interwoven tapestry of Regency England, a world of stark contrasts and undeniable connections. We've peered behind the shimmering curtain of the London season, a social chessboard where strategy often trumped sentiment, where debutantes and dowagers alike navigated a glittering yet ruthless landscape of social climbing and dynastic ambition. We then explored the surprisingly demanding existence of the noble woman, whose life, once the initial triumph of a successful match was secured, transformed into a relentless symphony of household management, the immense pressure of securing an heir, and the constant performance required to maintain her husband's social and political standing. And finally, we descended into the dust and dung of the rural countryside, witnessing the extraordinary, yet often invisible life of the peasant woman. Hers was a world defined not by grand balls or political intrigue, but by the relentless rhythm of the seasons, the ache of tired muscles, and the quiet, unwavering determination to put food on the table for her family. We've journeyed from her childhood chores to the stark realities of her marriage, from the bone-wearying toil of her daily life to the perilous miracle of childbirth. Her story, along with those of the noble woman and the social dance of the season, reminds us that beneath the glittering surface of the Regency era, for every duchess in silk there were countless women in homespun. Their strengths, their resilience, and their sheer tenacity, whether managing vast estates or simply surviving the next harvest, were the true unsung pillars of a society built on invisible labour and silent expectations. If this deep dive into the varied, often challenging realities of Regency women's lives has given you a new perspective, please do give this video a like. Your support helps us bring more hidden histories to light. And if you're eager to explore more lives from the past, both celebrated and forgotten, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these Regency lives surprised you the most, and why? And what other often overlooked historical figures or periods would you like us to explore next? Thank you for joining us on this extensive journey through time. Until next time, keep exploring the past. Good night and see you in the next video.